activity with communal norms and standards like any other human activity. Then within that, he's going to say there are certain circumstances that lead to this notion of paradigm shift and revolution in science. What do you think those might be? I mean, what would be an example of a paradigm? What do you think would be something that would provoke revolution in this sense? Yeah.
Just natural climate change, for instance, or I think our surroundings changing.
Yeah, something changing in what's happening around us. I mean, as a matter of fact, one of the key changes that happens in the switch from the heliocentric from the geocentric to heliocentric is simply a problem with calendars. You know, there's suddenly a Christian issue with calendars. The calendars are not working properly. You're having a whole fight over calendars. Everybody's realizing the system doesn't work precisely enough for that. And that provokes everybody to have to rethink things. But also, as you say, it might be larger phenomena of wide-scale transformations. I mean, something like geological or climate change today would be an example. What else might cause this kind of change? Say within a community. I mean, what's going to provoke revolutionaries in this sense? Yeah.
All of money system or some sort of like that.
Like some, you mean like a reward system?
I was thinking more of like the banking or the dollar bill or the money system.
I can see a couple of ways. Where that might work. I guess, and I think in general, actually there'll be a big debate about capitalism and how that's going to function within this. And that's going to be a huge player for sure, because we're going to have a new system where you're rewarded for changing the system, not for keeping the system going as it was, as long as it's making money. How about more sociologically? What kind of people are going to be the ones who create these scientific revolutions?
Radicals.
What's that?
Radicals.
Radicals. Who would be a radical? Or let me put it another way. Who's going to have less of a stake in the old system? Young people. I mean, Kuhn, one of his basic points is to say young people and outsiders. Right? At this point, you've probably all heard this part of Kuhn's argument, actually, in one way or another. But he basically simply says, yeah, actually, a lot of times the most esteemed, well-respected scientists will be exactly the ones who cease to be able to make this kind of revolution. And he doesn't mean that as a sign of disrespect. He just means to say they're thinking the old way, they have an investment in the old way. If you're young, you can switch systems, you can do something else. He also says almost always people who make these changes are coming from another field. You know, they often are somebody who's not the expert in the field they're heading into, but are able to radically transform that field. And that will be important for various reasons. And then finally, he's going to say a number of things. You also suggest when you have social cultural transformations that are occurring. And as that's changing, that will be an issue. With this, he's going to say what's needed is a version of history that starts to make sense of and assume that science is closely related with culture and society. And assume that the way in which people are imagining, the imaginary as they call it, imaginary of how people are understanding science is actually closely connected with how the rest of society is functioning. And that scientists in many ways will be people who apply that. You know, in the case of Einstein, for instance, the fact that Einstein was reading lots of philosophy in his day, Ernst Mach and a lot of other people, and was really looking for places in science where you could sort of simplify, nominalize things. Time and space was particularly bold, but that was because that was a general cultural phenomenon at the turn of the century. Right? Old empires are collapsing, people are looking at new ways of organizing science. And Kuhn wants to say we first of all have to get rid of the idea that science is essentially ahistorical, that it's simply revealing a given truth, and instead look at it as a community activity that creates real standards and consistencies of truth, but nonetheless which also at the same time is based in community. I mean, as he puts it at one point, scientific revolutions in his overall summary, they're the tradition-shattering complements tradition-bound activity of normal science. But within that, they're based particularly on practitioners. I take paradigms I take to be universally recognized scientific achievements that for a time provide model problems and solutions to the community of practitioners. Right? So he's going to look at science not as a copy of the outside world, but as something a group of people do that develop standards and practices in the same way as the financial system does, or in the same way as architecture or any other phenomena does, rather than something that's separate from all those. He notes by saying that this is in part something where historians themselves, even when they weren't doing science, started to notice that even bad ideas of science can be really important. So just to give you one example, medieval cathedrals, probably some of you have been in them. The entire concept of stained glass is based on a set of scientific ideas of basically Neoplatonism, that there's basically higher levels of being as we approach God. We're going to ever more refined essences. Remember I talked about the Aristotelian notion of levels, with fire being a sort of higher level, light being a higher level. Each of the forms of light having itself its own essence and power. And essentially for a 13th or 14th century person to go into a cathedral was apparently a radically different thing than it would be for us, right? We sort of walk in and think, oh, pretty light. Whereas they think of the light itself as part of a higher level of being. And that's an important fact in history, right? Scientists used to not really care about that fact particularly, right? It just shows that people had an odd idea of what light was. But suddenly when you start to think about how scientific revolutions are happening and what they are, the entire sort of construct of what history is starts to matter. And that becomes sort of part of the revolution that Kuhn starts to develop. I want to wrap this up in a second, but I just have a couple of different endings. I want to make sure to get to the one that I liked best. How much time we have. Because I don't have time for your questions. I guess I'll give this an ending and a code. Ending would be quick, because I'm sure you all have 9,000 things that you're doing in this LNT process and not getting enough sleep and all that. And then a code to sort of suggest the further importance of this. The ending is basically to say that what Kuhn really does is not only change the vision of science or history, but actually change the entire concept of human endeavor to say basically the world is one in which, in the words of Goethe, sort of all fact is already theory. Everything you think is a fact is in some way based in a theory, and everything you think is a theory is a way of enabling and converting the world into different kinds of facts. And Kuhn wants to say the purpose of history is to make people aware of that, because that's very hard to perceive in your own time. You assume that what's a fact is a fact. And the purpose of science is to be able to take those theories and look at them in a detailed, structured sort of way. And I'd say that's really sort of what made Structured Scientific Revolution such an important book in some ways. As a coda to that, I would say an irony of the story is that Kuhn himself and other historians would say he's not the first one to have actually any of these ideas. You know, as became quite clear, he said, well, actually I got almost all of these ideas from a set of German and Austrian philosophers of science. Remember we saw this example. You know, people who had already lived through their boom in time of science. You know, up until 1900, until the Nazis essentially, which effectively wrecked their scientific selves and when a lot of people emigrated to the US, you know, in which already you had people like Ludwig Fleck, a number of neo-Kantians, a number of other people already saying many of the same things about science. Not giving the sociological explanation that Kuhn gave, but giving essentially the same explanation. And Kuhn notes this, but everybody ignored it. But Kuhn is also sort of riding the high tide of American science, right? He becomes the one who becomes famous for saying this. I'm mentioning because it's important because since they started writing this stuff in 1895 or 1910 or so, it had a huge impact already in other fields. And I would just note that many of those are outside of science but did similar things. In fields like art history or social history, where people said, you know, it's really important to historicize what people think are facts and reveal them as theory, and that has political implications. I just close with one example, another very famous old book. It's impossible to read up there. I think it says Perspective as Symbolic Form. It's by a guy named Erwin Panofsky. It's sort of a canonical book in art history. Panofsky basically, incidentally, in addition to inventing the slide lecture format in art, here it is. Panofsky basically said even something like perspective drawing, that we think is totally obvious and natural, is in fact a construction. Yes, it's an extremely good way of conveying things in 3 dimensions, but we should never be fooled into thinking it's actually the true way of drawing things. And the book does sort of a brilliant job talking about both the history and the practice of perspective drawing. And saying this isn't necessarily more superior to what's happening in Islamic art or Chinese art or any other kind of art at the same time. It's simply a powerful construct that was invented at the same time in many ways as modern natural science. And he wants to say that that construct has its own rules, but it too is a way of sort of theory converting itself into fact and then being read as fact by people around it. And I'd say that's sort of the revolution of the book. Okay, I'll end there and take